All right, well, it's a little after 2. Maybe a few more people will pop in. Gail, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for inspiring this topic. I'm not really sure that I'm going to answer your question, but we'll see.
No, this is good. I'm looking forward to it.
So, this might be a little rudimentary, but I think it's good to kind of review some of the basics, and because there's always some nuances to the basics. So our topic this month is line weights particularly, but graphics in Vectorworks generally. So I'll touch on a couple of other things. One of the things that I've noticed in recent years is that I tend to see more and more professionally produced drawings that really don't make a whole lot of use of line weights. So I'll go ahead and put on my old Cadre cap, and I don't know if it's just not something that is emphasized in school, or if the preponderance of CAD and BIM has made the discipline of line weights sort of secondary, or perhaps there's more emphasis on 3D renderings and telling the graphical story of a project in 3 dimensions, and so 2-dimensional rendering is sort of fallen by the wayside, just because we just all have a limited bandwidth as to how much we can do. So by shifting our attention to more 3D, maybe we're losing some of the evocativeness of 2D. This little sketch that I'm sharing, hopefully I didn't draw it, found it online, but it's a great example of how line weights are used very effectively in order to communicate clearly what's going on, and from sort of a bold outline for the little building, to medium line weights in between, the use of shading, some fainter lines for wood grain, and so forth. It's just a little drawing that I think clearly makes the case why line weights are important. And I'll keep using the word line weights because that's sort of how we've always referred to it. But within a context of Vectorworks, Vectorworks refers to line weights as line thicknesses. So those terms are pretty much interchangeable. I suppose we could get into semantics, but I'll try to avoid that. So really, at the end of the day, our drawings have to communicate to somebody. If we're fairly highly trained design professionals of whatever discipline, I think the chances are pretty good that our level of graphic communication as the communicator is probably greater than the tradesman or the contractor who's reading the drawings in the field, because they spend their time reading drawings and we spend our time making drawings. So it makes sense that we'd be, more facile at making drawings. And in construction, of course, errors can be expensive or even dangerous. And so anything that we can do to better communicate our design intent is to the good. And so I think if we were to do a little seminar on risk management, there would be some discussion of line weights, believe it or not. In fact, the AIA several years ago now had a really great series of I think 6 articles that got turned into a book called Drawing the Line. And it was 2 sort of very experienced architects writing these articles about the importance of graphic communication, line weights being one of them. And if you want to email me later, I'll dig up the reference and send it to you. Or you could just buy my book, because I'm pretty sure it's in the bibliography. So there. Okay, so let's talk about some Vectorworks basics. I'm going to go ahead and share something else if I can find it. Hold on, I've got to unhide my Vectorworks. There we go. And yeah, we'll start with this untitled document. That's perfect. Okay, so here we have a brand spanking new blank Vectorworks document. And you can see under the tools menu, under options, we've got line thicknesses as an option. So let's have a look at that. So you can see that there are 10 preferred line thicknesses that you get to set in Vectorworks. These are in millimeters, and the highest value that Vectorworks will give you is about 6.5 millimeters, which is quite thick. Can also go down to as thin as a 0.03 millimeter. If we click over to mils, which are thousandths of an inch, you can see that the 0.03 millimeters corresponds to 1 mil, and the maximum acceptable value now goes up to 255. So now we immediately understand why the range limit in Vectorworks is from 0.03 millimeters to 6.48 or whatever it is, because that corresponds to 1 to 255 mils, which is of course that's a base 2 number 256, 0 being the 256th value. So there you go. So fun fact, under the hood, line thickness units in Vectorworks are mils. For I think most of us were probably trained to think in terms of millimeters. These are the standard or preferred line thicknesses that you can establish for your particular machine. So these are user-specific or workstation-specific settings. And so I've customized these for something that works for me. I almost never use the 0.03 except for dimension lines. I like them super thin so they don't get confused for drawing elements. And then I use a lot of number 2, 3, 5, and 6, rarely 7. And the old sort of drafting rule of thumb was you might have bought a box of 8 technical pens back in the day, but really you only need about 4 or 5, and you want a good variation. You don't want them to be so close together that they're almost indistinguishable. So you can, of course, draw a line in any line thickness. Right here, you've got, pull this over so you can see a little better. So I just drew a line, 0.05 is the default here. Here are my 10 preferred, right? You can see I can pick a 0.53, there we go. But if I want to draw a line that's a 0.4, no problem. I can just click on set thickness and make it 0.4 millimeters, and there it is. It's 0.4 millimeters, right? So pretty straightforward. So just because you have the 10 line weights at your disposal doesn't mean that that's all you can do. Those are just your 10 most common, I suppose. Now, one other thing that you could do with your line weights is that, or with your lines, is in addition to specifying the thickness, you can specify an opacity. So I'm going to actually draw a rectangle for this. And I'll go ahead and give it, say, a 0.3, and give it a color. All right. There we go. So if I click over here on my opacity, by default, the pen and the fill opacity are linked. So if I make my fill opacity 30% and my pen opacity 30%, they're both 30%. But I can also unlink those, and then I can specify, say, 100% for the fill and 30% for the pen, which that's actually kind of hard to read. So let me just give it no fill. And so here we've got a 0.3 pen. I'll go ahead and change this one to 0.3, right? So I've got a rectangle that's a 0.3 millimeter, a line that's a 0.3 millimeter. This one's at 30%, this one's at 100%. So this is where we get into the semantics of line thickness and line weight. The thickness is exactly the same, but because I've dialed down the opacity of this one, of the rectangle, it's got a lighter weight. So oftentimes in rendering things like wood grain texture or stone or something like that in 2 dimensions, I might use a heavier line weight, but give it a certain degree of opacity so that it's wide and light. Now you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't I'll just duplicate this rectangle and I'll just make it gray, but with 100% opacity, right? And I'll go ahead and pick a slightly darker gray. Little trial and error here, if you'll bear with me. So that these two appear to be, more or less about the same grayness, right? So this one is actually gray at 100%. There we go. That was throwing me. Still fiddling with it. Okay, that's better. These are pretty close, almost indistinguishable. So the rectangle here, upper right, is black at 30%. And this rectangle is solid gray at 100%, but it's a gray that's about 30% tone. So why wouldn't I just use that instead of using opaque? Why not just use the gray color instead of a black line at 30%? So right now I'm in color mode, right? I can make this line over here, for example, magenta. I'm in color mode. But if I were to print in black and white, if I don't change any of my settings and I just print to a black and white printer, what'll happen is the black and white printer will try to approximate the same tonal value of the color line, whether it's gray or magenta, with a tonally equivalent amount of black ink, which means that like something in yellow is going to be very, very faint, right? But if I switch to black and white mode up over here, something interesting will happen. What happens in black and white mode is that for lines anyway, any color other than white is going to render as black. So I can take this line here and I can make it a super light gray right over here, and it's still rendering as just completely black. It's not until I make the line actually white, this first color here on my palette, that the line actually disappears. I mean, it's still visible to us on screen, but it would not print unless there's a printer out there with white ink, which I think is exceedingly rare. So there you go. When you switch over to black and white mode, all of your colors, your light grays and your medium grays and so forth, are just going to print as black. Whereas if you choose a black pen color, but dial down the opacity, now it's going to print as 30% black, what we might call, a medium to light gray. So that's why opacity is important as a method of 2D graphical communication in Vectorworks, because when you print in black and white mode, you can get a lot of control of your grays that otherwise would be lost to you. So that's pretty important. Any questions about that so far? Let me do a quick check to see if there are any chats. No chats, no chat questions yet. Great. All right. Well, then I'll move on. Or if somebody wants to unmute and lob a question over the transom. All right. Now, so far, I've been assigning line weights to objects individually on an ad hoc or case-by-case basis. Turn on my do not disturb here. On an ad hoc or case-by-case basis, just using the attributes palette. But far more preferable way to address this is with classes. So I'm just pulling up an old file here that we discussed a few meetings ago, just because it has a bunch of classes in it. So let's go ahead and look at that class structure. So here are all the classes in this document, and you can see that I can sort those classes by name, of course. I can also sort them by line thickness, right, or by pen color. Right. If I sort them by line thickness, you can see that pretty much all of these sort of magenta, or I'm sorry, not magenta, but lavender or periwinkle lines are about a 0.08, right? Some of them are black. And then when I get to these red lines, these are all a 0.15. And then there's some other line weights that came in from Vectorworks that I didn't, sort of imported when I imported that marionette object for the downspout. And then here are some lines at 0.3, and those are dark green. So what I tend to do is assign all of the line weights to my objects by class, and try to avoid as much as possible assigning them on an individual case-by-case basis. You know, why? Well, let me draw a line, and then I'll go ahead and assign it to the wall class that I have here, a wall exterior. There it is. And so you can see that immediately by assigning it to the class, because I've assigned a line weight and a pen color to that class, that line is automatically set to the correct line weight and pen color, as you can see from the attribute palette. Now, very important, in your class definition, let's go to edit that. In your class definition, you can assign under graphic attributes a style, a color, a weight, markers, so forth. You can even assign opacity. And if you don't check use at creation over here, then these graphic attributes will not be assigned by default to any objects created and assigned to that class. So it's very important for most of your classes to use at creation. Otherwise, you're really losing the benefit of having a class attribute assigned, a graphic attribute assigned to a class. Now, there are a couple of exceptions that I make to that. For example, my none class tends to be a container class, and so I don't tend to assign that to any particular graphic attributes to objects that way. There's some good reasons why you would want to assign your line weights to classes. One of them, as I said, is just out of sheer efficiency or laziness, however you want to characterize it. Saves you a lot of time having to manually assign line weights to objects. But there's another good reason, and that is if we use viewports. So I don't really have a viewport here set up, but let's go ahead and set one up. So I'll just create a new viewport and put it on a new sheet layer. And I'm not going to worry too much about, all of this. So there we go. So here we've got a little view here, and let's go to our classes, and we can turn off our ceiling class and preview that. Yeah, that's good. And maybe what we want to do is, instead of having the roof be a solid pen, we're going to assign a line type to that, and even make it lighter, and even change the pen weight. There we go. And while we're at it, we'll turn off the gutters. Right. So, and I can even, let me go back to the roof class. I'll give it no fill. Great. I'm getting a bit of a double line. I'll undo that. So there we go. Let's crop it just for fun. So now I've got this floor plan, and my roof is shown dashed in a lighter line weight, right? And if I go back to the design layer, you'll see that I haven't actually changed the graphic attributes of the roof itself. I'm just overriding those attributes in the viewport. And that's incredibly useful. And one of the things that really makes viewports powerful is that I can have a standard appearance for most, by default, for any object in a given class. But then on a viewport by viewport basis, I can override those and have them appear the way that I need to in that particular class. So, a very common example is in a foundation plan, I might turn on the plumbing class, but I might show all of that dashed. Now, watch what happens if I take this this roof and let me go ahead and edit the style. Kind of jumping ahead of myself. Actually, what I'll do is, yeah, sure, why not? So under the roof attributes, you see that I've, for the roof, everything is by class. But let's go ahead and change the weight to a 3 and the color to magenta, and the style is going to be solid. So there we go. I get a nice heavy magenta line. That's wonderful. It looks great. But lo and behold, when I go back to my viewport, suddenly that override, it isn't gone, it's still there, right? My roof main class is still being shown in this viewport with my above dashed line style, my magenta, or sorry, my lavender pen 08 and so forth. But that roof is not. Let me go back. I'll draw just a line here, just any old line. I'll put it in the roof class. Right, I'll make sure that everything is make all attributes by class. Let's go back to that viewport. So here, this line is showing up the way I would expect to. I'm looking at the viewport again. Okay, that line is showing up the way that I would expect it to, because the roof class is being overridden in the viewport, but the roof is not. Why? Because the line is being drawn by class, whereas the roof, its class attributes are being overridden at the object level. So one way to think about it is that the viewport settings will override the class settings, but the individual object attribute settings override anything else. And so if you are in the habit of drawing objects and assigning line weights, pen colors, and so forth through the attributes palette and override your classes, then you're going to lose out on this very powerful characteristic or feature of viewports, which is the ability to override classes. So this is just bothering me to no end. I'm going to have to go back to this roof style and go back to its attributes and make everything by class. Phew, I feel so much better. There we go. Now, if I want my roof class to be this heavy magenta line, that's not a problem. I'll just go to my classes menu for my overall document, and I'll go to this roof main class and edit that. Right? And sure, let's have fun. Let's make it a 0.3 magenta line. Wonderful. That doesn't change the viewport because the viewport overrides that class with the lighter dashed line. I go back to my design layer, and here it is because this is by class in the design layer. Any questions about that? Super powerful, super useful to be able to use class overrides in viewports. I sense a question coming.
Francois, Bill Vandersteel, I have a question. When you were going to your class palettes, you had assigned a color to the various line weights or line thicknesses so that all the line thickness were a certain color, but that didn't necessarily line up with the particular classes. So I'm confused as to what the objective is in giving each line thickness its own color. Like all the 0.15s are green, let's say, and all the 0.3s are red. What's the point of that?
Yeah, Bill, thank you so much for catching that. That was actually in my outline, but I in my eagerness, I skipped right over it. Yeah, so this is just a personal thing that I do. And it's because monitors don't have, retina displays or, high, 5K, 4K monitors, whatever, are, much better than they used to be in the old 72 to 90 DPI days, but they still don't carry line weights or differentiate them as clearly as a nice printed drawing. So I've adopted a convention for myself in my classes and in my line weights where manually, this is just me, something that I'm doing. If a pen is an 08, I'm going to give it either black or this periwinkle or lavender color. Okay, if it's a 1.5 millimeter, I'm going to make it red. These 0.25s, Vectorworks made those as marionette classes, so I didn't make those. We'll ignore those. And if it's a 0.3, I make it this olive green, and so forth. So I have different colors by convention, purely as for my own convenience, so that when I'm just humming along, drafting away, I see a line right here, this little threshold line at the door, that's a 0.08 line. I don't need to zoom in to say, oh, did I draw that line thin enough? No, I know it's magenta, or I'm sorry, I keep saying magenta. I know that it's lavender or periwinkle, and so I know flat out, that's my light pen weight. I don't have to think about it. I see a 0.15 line, I see a red line, I know that's 0.15. Again, that's strictly a convention that I've sort of made up for myself years and years ago. I picked some colors that were easily distinguishable, whether you were in a white background or a dark background mode, right? So they read fine this way or that way. And that just lets me know at a glance if something is at a line weight that I think is appropriate.
Okay, I saw you went through this many years ago, and apparently I misunderstood you at that time because I think it got abandoned with one of the upgrades, but I made a situation where I had assigned line weights to line colors to classes as opposed to the line thickness. And I found that helpful because frequently I have a habit of not changing classes when I'm changing what I'm drawing. And let's say I've got, I don't know, roofs in blue, and I'm drawing, I start drawing a line for an outline for a wall, and it's blue. Oh, I'm in the wrong class. I know I use the colors to remind me what class I'm in. That's how I interpreted it many years ago.
Oh yeah, no, that works too. If that works for you, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to draw stuff in the none class and then assign it as I go, just because I'm keep jumping around from
Yeah.
class to class, and I don't want to draw walls in the roof class and vice versa. So yeah, I think your convention is valuable, and if that works for you, that's great. This is just, you know, kind of something that I started doing literally decades ago, and you know, old dogs, new tricks. No.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. But this is, you know, as you can tell from this, how I've edited this roof class, this is strictly just a personal convention of mine. There's no actual like hard-coded relationship between pen weight and line color. It's just my convention.
Can
Yeah.
you address nested line weights, like within the roof or the wall?
Yes, I'm going to get to that.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yep, totally going to do that. So again, just to go back to your line thicknesses, that if you've got line weights or line thicknesses that are assigned ad hoc, that is through the attributes palette, not by class, then you won't be able to override them in viewports. So since we're talking about viewports, let's go back to this sheet over here. And I'm just going to drag this viewport up and duplicate it. And instead of top plan, let's just go ahead and go with a front. And I've got a crop on that, so we can get rid of that. All right. Okay. And we'll just call this another viewport. Great. And let's go ahead and show that not as a wireframe, but as a hidden line, and update that. Okay. So here's a viewport. And you can see that, again, going back to my conventions, right? You can see at a glance that edge of that roof is a pretty light line weight. It's a 0.08 because that's the roof class has been overridden. So I could say, oh, well, gee, I really want that roof to pop. So let's go ahead and override that class here. And instead of making the roof main like a light line, dash doesn't really make sense in a hidden line rendering. Let's go ahead and make this a solid dark green line. And we'll just make it, sorry, solid. Great. Boom. All right, and then I'll update that viewport. So that kind of works, right? That kind of works. I get a nice heavy outline at the edge of the roof and over here at the fascia. But then when I get to the wall, that kind of breaks down. And then also, if you zoom in, you can see I've got this really heavy double line. And then there's this lighter, but still not super thin line below it. So what's going to happen here is that this is not really going to render the way that I particularly want it. That the things are going great along the top of the roof and the edge, but then back in here, not so much, right? Likewise, the stone here is not the same line weight as the edge of the roof, and the profile of the stone should be heavier. And then this line between the stone and the stucco or whatever that is above it, that should be lighter than this line. But if I've got all of the stone in one same sort of line weight, then all of the stone everywhere is going to be the same. In other words, the line weights that I've devised for myself are more about how objects appear in plan, and those line weights or line thicknesses are not as useful for objects that I'm seeing in elevation or section, particularly in elevation. And the other thing to think about is this is a very simple little corner of a building, but if you had the same roof, say 50 feet back, you know, farther back in the drawing, those two roofs would render the exact same, where in fact there's a huge depth difference, and so they shouldn't. So rendering by line weight by object type in an elevation or a section doesn't really make much sense. So another great way to use line weights is for rendering your 2D objects. So one thing you could do is you could just go ahead and override all of these classes except maybe the none class and a couple of others. I'm going to override all of these classes to be, you know, I'll go ahead and make them that lavender color because that's what my eye is used to seeing. Okay, and update that. And now more or less everything's going to render the same sort of light line weight. And then I can go back into my annotations, right, and use my Polygon tool. And I could sort of laboriously click. I'll use loop to make it a little less laborious. And we can pretend that there's a ground line here. We'll just stop right here, right? And then maybe I'll go ahead and create a new class. I'll call it pen heavy, say. I'll make it visible everywhere. And use it creation, of course. And use my own sort of standard conventions. Boom. So now there's the pen heavy. And then maybe I'll draw a line here and a line here. And create a new class, pen medium, visible, visible, boop, boop, red, 0.15, none, okay. And then new class, pen, very heavy. And that one I might even actually add some more vertices to hide part of the model, and then I'll hide those edges. There we go. Oh, sorry. Make those attributes by class, boom. And if I even want to, I could go ahead and drop some rectangles in those windows and create a new class and call it pen shading, or, you know, whatever. And give that a solid black fill, no line, and say 25%. There we go. All right, so now I've got a bunch of classes to help me with my 2D rendering, and I can sort of override or just use kind of a default light line weight for everything except where I want to render it. Now, for something like this outline, you know, the other thing that I can do I kind of did it quickly here with the shading, is instead of drawing a rectangle, let me do that again. If I go to the polygon tool, I can do a polygon by vertex mode, which we're probably all pretty familiar with. But there's also this paint bucket mode, and I can just go ahead and put those in there and assign that to the pen shading class, right? And then I also have in the polygon mode, I have this lasso mode where I can just draw a lasso. It'll just capture all that geometry. Oh, that's interesting. How did it do that? Very interesting. I'm not supposed to do that. Huh. All right. Well, there we go. I'm supposed to outline my building, but this time I didn't. Well, just undo, I guess. Find another instance where that actually works. So, so that's just a nice way to, quickly render up your viewports to give some additional depth cues and make your drawings a little more legible.
Francois.
Yeah.
So did I miss that? So using that polygon in the paint bucket mode would be instead of hand drawing the polygon around your perimeter?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know why it's not doing it, but it could be because this building is sort of open-ended. That it's not finding that profile. But the way I'll show you the way the lasso mode works. I'll just duplicate this viewport and I'll just ungroup it. Or actually, I think it's Command K. No. Ungroup. No. Convert to lines. There we go. There we go. There we go. Yeah, convert to lines. So that's just a bunch of lines, right? So the way the polygon lasso mode works should work now. Wow. It's really hating me today.
What happens when you lasso the other direction?
The other direction.
Yeah, what happens when you do that? Like
Counterclockwise.
Yeah, nothing.
Wow. That's amazing. Why would it do that? This is a new feature. Matt, that's cool.
Yeah, the
Yep,
directional changed up.
Didn't matter. So anyway, you can see here, at least on the group, where yeah, the lasso gives you that nice outline. So we'll just go ahead and pop that, or heavy. Yep. And so for complicated shapes, that's just like the lasso mode and the paint bucket mode for the polygon tool. It just makes outlining and rendering your elevations and sections just very, very quick. And fun, except when it doesn't work. But almost always works, except when you're doing a presentation. Then it's recalcitrant. Does that help, Gail?
Yes, thank you. That's great.
All right, yeah, yep, you're welcome. Okay, so there's a couple of other things to think about lines. So if we go back to this viewport here, right? What I might want to do is, well, let's just, in our resource manager, let's look at some line styles. So here's our file. So you can see I've got this above line, let's look and see what that looks like. Come on. So I'll just edit that line type. And so whenever you want it, you can create a new line type or you can edit an existing one. And you get this little ruler. Let's just go ahead and create a new one. All right. And so you get this sort of ruler, and you've got these two sliders over here. And so the line always starts solid, and the first of the pair of sliders tells you how long that line is solid before it's gapped. And then the second one defines the gap, and then it repeats. So I can also do this numerically instead of graphically. So I'll do a line length of 1 inch and then a gap of 1/4 inch, right? And if I make that, all these lines are going to be in page inches. In other words, the line style is going, or the line type is going to look the same regardless of the scale of the drawing. It'll always be an inch when I put down a ruler on a hypothetical print of the drawing, it's not scaled, right? And if I want a more developed line, like let's say I want a straight line with a dot, then I would just grab this little slider off to the right and drag it on, and that gives me another pair of sliders. And so I can jam that almost always all the way to the end. Maybe I'll just make it 0.02, and I'll make the gap length 0.25, and then you can see it just repeats that 1 inch, the gap, the very short line, i.e. a dot, the gap, and then it repeats. And if I want something even more complex, right, then I can make a solid with 2 dots and a gap, and maybe this middle gap is, 1/8 of an inch. So 1 inch solid, 1/4 inch gap, dot, 1/8 inch gap, dot, 1/4 inch gap, and so on. And then I can go ahead and scale that with your line thickness or not. So if I don't, then those are just going to be, the same pattern regardless of how thick the line is, or if the line is thick, it'll scale up, or then it'll scale down. Yep. And I can also have a more complex line, which is this little cloud line style, where I've got some geometry. In this case, just this little polyline that I drew kind of roughly to make these little clouds, and those just sort of repeat. So those are the two kinds of line styles, or line types, excuse me, that are available to me. A simple one like these dashed lines, this graphic property lines, sight lines, whatever, and then a more complex one where I might even have a little bit of text here, and then that will repeat for things like, fences or overhead electric lines or whatnot.
Francois, will the text scale according to the drawing, or is it a fixed height?
I think it's a fixed height. Excuse me. Let's experiment. So, nope, this one is scaling, because when I'm in the viewport, I'll copy that line and paste it in the annotations. And obviously it's scaling in this case. I think I can change that. Let me play with that. So if I play with the settings, then I can either choose to make it page scale or world scale. So page scale, it'll appear the same regardless of what the scale is, including 1:1. World scale, and it would scale based on the scale of the design layer or the viewport that it's in.
I'm sorry, would you talk a little bit about the difference between line thicknesses and how they appear in page versus world? That always confuses me.
Line thicknesses don't change with scale.
In which one?
Either. So when you print a 0.3 millimeter line, assuming you have a ruler fine enough to be able to measure that, right? It will be 0.3 millimeters in whether you print at 1:1 scale or 1/4 inch scale, 1/8 inch scale, 3/16, 1 inch equals 50 or whatnot. That's a great point. So let's go back to here, right? Let's say that I'm assuming that my drawings are, there it is. Let's say that I'm assuming that my drawings are more or less a 1/4 inch scale, right? But I want this elevation to be at 1/16. Suddenly those line weights are going to be, pretty hefty. So I've got a couple of options, right? One thing I could do is I could just go to my classes and I could just go through and scale all of these down by overriding the class definitions. So pen heavy could go from a 0.13 to a 0.15, for example, right? That would be one option. Under my advanced properties, though, I can also scale my line weights. Which may be hard to read. Let's go ahead and look at advanced properties, make that one 1. Yeah, not convinced. That's really,
Do you have to do the line type scale as well?
no, because that scales the length. I wonder why it's not doing that. That's odd, isn't it? Yeah. So in this case, I think I would just want to override my line weights. Now, the good news is that the Eyedropper tool will work on all of your viewport settings, right? So if I go ahead and grab the Eyedropper tool and check its settings and make sure that under viewport attributes, I'm picking up class overrides, right? Then I can pick up these attributes and put them down on that one, and it will go ahead and override them. I'm not sure why that's not those lines should scale. Maybe it only works in plan. That might be the case. Yeah. So in plan, these lines are all super thin. You can see when I changed that to 0.15, all of this got real thin versus thick here. So line types are super useful because you can create some graphic standards for yourself, and then you can apply them very uniformly, very consistently from drawing to drawing. And then, as you probably noticed in the classes menu, that you can also assign line types to specific classes. So for example, in my ceiling overhead class, right, I've got my above line type assigned. So that's one benefit. Let's see. Just want to catch up on my chats. Yeah, so Bill, you were asking about line types and how to create line types and import them. Line types are just resources that live in the resource manager. So you've got a couple of ways of importing them. You can just use the resource manager to browse to a file that has line types and just import them that way. Or if there's a line assigned to a line or any object really, then when you copy and paste, import that object, the line type will.
Is there an outdoor, an internet source of great line types that we can look to as a library to bring them into my Vectorworks that I've never seen before?
Yeah, if you're in your resource manager and you're looking at line types and you go to Vectorworks libraries, right? And you go to defaults, right? Here are some attributes, line types, default line styles. Boom, there's a bunch of them. Right? And then I don't know if there are any additional in, nope, RenderWorks hatches, object styles, that's it. So that's where I would look. And then of course, you know, if you're importing say DWGs or DXFs, any kind of line styles are gonna import their equivalent. It's gonna get translated to line styles, but you may need to scale them up or down.
Oh, that's one way. Okay.
So those are two options, and there may be some additional ones in the Vectorworks like third-party area of their website. It's like where people have created them, as well as of course on the discussion board. So that's one useful thing about line types. Now, I'm just going to go back in time to a long time ago when Vectorworks first was MiniCAD. A virtual pen tip was a square like what I've just drawn, and if you drew a horizontal line, essentially what Vectorworks was doing was it was just sort of projecting this square and creating this, you know, horizontal line like that. Yep. And then if you were drawing a vertical line, then Vectorworks was sort of dragging that square and giving you a vertical line. And so that might look something like this. Yeah. But if you were drawing a line on a bias, what Vectorworks would do is it would give you a line like this. And I say Vectorworks. This is, you know, back in the days of MiniCAD. So you can see that that line is actually heavier or thicker than this line. Whoops. Or this one, right? It's a sine function. So on a 45, it's going to be 41% thicker. So then the solution to that was to give us round pens. And so now with a round pen, that line looks like this. And regardless of the angle, obviously, it's going to give you the same thickness. Yep. Makes sense. Problem being, if you have a really thick line, like really thick, massively thick line, your line is going to have a little round tip. Now, that makes some people crazy. Personally, I don't draw with lines that thick, and so this doesn't bother me. But if this is, now that I've shown you this, if this is going to cause you to lose sleep at night, your solution is going to be to create a line type, a complex line type, right, that is made of rectangles, maybe even really, really short rectangles that all repeat. And so now when I draw that line, whew, that's a huge one. Let's edit the settings and make that page. Might still be. I might need to edit that to make it really thin, but you get the idea. I'm making a line type that is a solid rectangle instead of just a line, and then I can have a solid line and the end of it is a square tip. So that's an absurdly thick line, obviously, but you get the idea.
Just keep in mind your old pens used to be round on the end.
Yeah. So you might need to go to your classes and, you know, change out the line style from none to, you know, this new thick line style or square tip line style. So there you go. All right. Well, I need to push forward. So let's go back to our walls, right? And this will do for our discussion about, it's the same thing for a component. There was a question earlier about wall styles, and right. So here you can see that my wall has a heavy outline. I'm doing this in black and white just so that it's a little more visible, a heavy outline. And then each of the components has its own weight. Now, in this case, I've got a class for the baseboard. It's the finish trim. So when I turn that off, right, I lose that overall thickness. That base trim doesn't have an overall thickness. Let's go to the design layer. Okay. And let's examine this line style. So there's a couple of things. One is that I'm assigning a class to each and every one of my components, right? They all have their own unique class. And each of those classes, I'm careful to make the fill, the texture, and the pens, make all those attributes by class. And the reason that I do that, obviously, is so that when I go back to my viewport, I can go ahead and, I don't know why I would ever do this, but because we can, we shall. Let's go ahead and give the base trim no fill and a skinny little thin line, and turn it on, of course. Right. Oh, there we go. This is beautiful. This is perfect. So what's going on here? Like you were expecting the base trim to be dashed, but now I've got this overall, heavy line at the base trim. So what's happening here, let's go back to the design layer, is that the wall as a whole, in addition to having all of the individual classes, the wall as a whole has attributes, right? So I can give it a fill, and I can give it a line weight, and all of those attributes can either be forced or they can be by the class of the that the wall is. So if I look at insertion options, you can see that the class is the wall exterior class. And if we go to that class definition, there's wall exterior. Again, you can see it's got a 0.03. It's got a use at creation. It's got a poche, sort of a pattern fill. And so that wall, the overall wall, is going to be given by that class. And then each of the components will have their own sort of line weights within the overall assembly. So if I don't want that to be the case, then what I might do is under edit wall attributes, give it, say, no fill and no pen. We'll just see what that does. I don't usually do it this way. Yep. So now each component has its own line weight. And if I go back to my viewport, then it's more like what I was expecting. I'm getting a 0.13 line around the frame wall. I'm still seeing the sheathing and the air gap. The stone is lighter, right? And that base trim is dashed that way. So if you want your overall wall to have, or roof slab or roof object or roof slab to have an overall sort of an outline, then you would give it that kind of treatment in the insertion of the in the attributes of the wall as a whole. And if you don't, if you only want to see the attributes of the individual components, and you don't want the wall itself to have any a particular line weight or whatever, then you would just set that to none. So for example, here, if I wanted the left-hand edge of the stone to be a heavy line weight, then I could just go to, let's go to the wall styles. And for the masonry, I could go ahead and make the left pen, the outermost pen, I could make that 0.13, for example. Boom, boom. Yep. And there it is. It's a 0.13 over here. go out of black and white. 0.13 olive pen here, a red 0.15 over there. Right. Let's go ahead and turn off sheathing and gypsum board, stucco too while we're at it, right? So there you go. So that's kind of the trick. Now, here's the deal. If you turn off all of the component classes, this is the downside. If you turn off all the component classes but still have the overall wall class on, you're just going to get a big nothing, right? Again, because that wall style under its overall wall attributes has no fill, no pen. If we make everything by class again, then you're going to get this nice sort of fat line of the overall wall, which, you know, might be nice to see for a site plan, for example. So that's kind of how components are handled in multi-component or withed objects like walls and slabs and roofs. There are classes or line weights that you can assign to individual components, but there's also a global class to the object as a whole. Any questions about that? All right.
Is that what you're doing? That's pretty cool, actually. I never thought about that. So the overall wall, you could poche with a transparent color, the overall wall, and show the classes and let the classes of the individual components show through. For example, if you want to distinguish between I don't know, a firewall versus a regular wall by poching it, or if it's a bearing wall versus a non-bearing wall. So they look the same in terms of their components, but you can show them separately by having an overlay poche of the entire wall. Is that a way of using it?
Yeah, no, because the overall wall characteristics are kind of in the background, so you don't see it. Here, I'll turn on something ludicrous like just sheathing.
Right.
So it's only when I turn on sheathing, when I only see the overall wall when all of my components are off.
Oh, okay.
When I have even one component on, you know, like sheathing, then suddenly, then and only then does it refer. If you wanted to have a kind of a different fire separation, or, you know, different kind of hatch or poche or whatever for firewalls versus non-firewalls, probably best to do that with a component class where the frame wall would be like, you know, structural, fire rated, non-fire rated, whatever.
Okay,
Or you could have a fire rating diagram. Anyway, there's just, yeah, you probably need to do it on a component by component basis.
Well, you answered
or turn off all your components and have different fire rated wall class.
So using the overall wall poche concept is really more of a graphic presentation technique I could use.
Yeah,
that's fine. I didn't know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. You might also be able to use data visualization to do that effectively, but that's a whole nother hour and a half.
Francois,
Yeah.
question. Am I thinking correctly that if we wanted just that solid wall like you've got shown right now, that we can set that in the viewport to combine all, I'm not remembering the terminology, show as one, what's the terminology? So instead of showing components, you
Yeah.
combine all of them.
So under your advanced properties, but no, not really. What you would need to do is basically turn off all the components, and then, and only then, would the attributes of the wall as a whole. So it's only when I've turned off all the components. If I turn on just one component, oh well, that one shows up. There you go. So that one's showing up. So I could do my stone. Right. Well, there you go. I wonder what's going on with my sheathing. That's odd. Yep, everything's by class. And then my wall attributes, all by class. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so again, if I'm showing individual components, their individual class, the overall wall doesn't really come into play until I turn off all those components, and then I would see the whole wall thickness, and I would see the whole wall thickness. So I've defined this wall to include a piece of 1x base trim. So the overall thickness of that wall is also going to include the base trim, which, you know, probably something that we would normally not think of as, you know, being part of the wall thickness. All right, I have to move on. I'm sorry. There's a couple other things that I wanted to touch on real quick. We can turn this trim off. Which are not walls, but they does have to do with lines. So let's just create this, and we'll do a let's make that, I don't know, 30 by 30. We'll model it as a tapered extrude. We'll give it a height of 8 feet and a 1, right? So we'll even taper it a little more extremely. There we go. Okay, and then let's make that 8 feet to 2 inches and 10 feet, and extrude that 18 inches, and then let's just move it up 8 feet. All right, whatever it is, I've got this thing, right? I'll go ahead and assign this to a class. I don't have a beam class. Well, let's just create one. Again, use it creation, solid, make it dark gray, I don't know. Okay. And I'll make this in the stone. All right, so let's say I've got this model element, right? And how do I, I want to control how that shows up. Obviously, I want this to be post-shade, right? So I would create an auto hybrid out of that, which has some default settings. So let's, sorry, and somehow I got into my text tool. So there's my auto, whoops, come on. There's my auto hybrid. Let's look at some of these components. So first of all, I get to decide what the cut plane elevation is. So if I make it, say, 6 feet, you can see that I see more of the taper. If I make it 3 feet, I see less of the taper, right? And then I have the cut plane, which I can make it the contained objects classes. So where it's actually sectioning, it's giving me the display of the stone component class. But I'm going to go ahead and give it a class 2D attribute, and I'll use the, I don't have a section style class. So well, here, let's just go with the heavy, heavy. Perfect. Okay. And then for below the cut plane, I can go ahead and use the 2D class attributes of my pen class, say, well, I don't have a light one. So we'll just go with medium. Okay. And then above the cut plane, I can also display that, only this time I'll do in the ceiling overhead class and use those class attributes. So use 2D class attributes means the 2D class attributes of that particular object or of that particular class. So there we go. And in my navigation, my ceiling overhead class is turned off. So let's go ahead and turn that on. So there we go. So anything that's overhead is showing up dashed. Anything that's being sectioned is showing up with the heavy line, and anything below is showing up with the solid red line. And I can even play with the pen. We can make this say pen very heavy, because that has a white fill, you may remember. There we go. So once again, having some classes that have some graphic attributes assigned to them is super useful for objects like auto hybrids. I know that's super quick, but it's amazing how you talk about line weights and suddenly an hour and a half has gone by. But I just wanted to make sure and touch on that last thing, and then just open it up to questions for the last couple of minutes, because I've got a hard stop at 1, fortunately. Are there any other questions about line weights? Something important I've probably forgotten or just kind of whizzed by too quickly?
Maybe just a quick thing. Am I understanding that if you change scales, you pretty much have to do a manual change of line weights? So like if you do a detail.
I would say if you have a drastic change of scale, yes. Let's just try this with a section viewport. Because they're a little bit more robust than just a regular viewport. So there's our section viewport. And so for its attributes under advanced properties, we'll do a merged cross section and put everything in the, let's say the pen very heavy class. And then for everything beyond, sure, we'll use the none class, see what that looks like. So yeah, there we go. And here I can, let's make my 3D, there we go. And merge cross sections, that's great. Infinite. Okay, and then under displays, let's just try a line weight scale of 0.5. So in section viewports, the line weight scale works just fine. Did you see that, Gail?
Yes, thank you, I did.
Yeah, because I blew past it really quickly. So if you're doing section viewports, that setting works fine. The setting to adjust line weights by scale for just ordinary viewports that are in like a front, side, whatever view, that does not work because ordinary viewports are, you know, they're just they're not as robust and feature filled unless it's a top plan view. And then in top plan view, right, even in an ordinary viewport, then that line weight scaling does work. So if you want your sections, or for that matter, your elevations, right, to show up with scaled line weights at small scales or very large scales, then you're going to want to use them, create them using the section viewport rather than just a conventional viewport in a front view.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
One thing I will say, and I mentioned this before, is that if you do a lot of like hatches and so forth in plan view, and you have your section viewport, for example, in this one, do you see how it says show planar objects and that's deselected? If you have that selected, then if you had like a rectangle that was hatched in plan with like, say, a stipple pattern, right? Vectorworks would display that, but on edge. So you really wouldn't see anything except a line, except that Vectorworks would still calculate all of the stipples. So you want to really be careful in your section viewports and your sort of other sort of elevation viewports to be very judicious about turning on planar objects and only have those on if you really intend for them to be. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. Didn't really expect that we would have so much to talk about, but I guess I should have known better. This has been recorded, so if you want a link to that, just let me know. If you have any sort of follow-up questions, of course, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and always welcome suggestions for upcoming topics. So any final remarks in the last 30 seconds or a minute?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So
Thanks
much.
as always.
Thanks
Very
for the
good.
great questions.
You bet. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.